Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with the arrogant confidence of youth, cut through the calm morning air at the shooting range. Sergeant Evans, his crisp Marine Corps utility uniform looking out of place among the civilian shooters, gestured, with a dismissive flick of his wrist, toward the rifle resting on the bench. I mean, seriously, what is that thing? Bernard Hicks, 87 years old, didn't turn. His hands, gnarled with age, but steady as granite, were busy chambering a single round into his rifle. He could feel the eyes of the young Marines. Behind him could hear their stifled snickers. His gaze remained fixed, downrange at the paper targets, shimmering in the heat 1,000 yards away. He had seen targets like this his whole life. Some had been paper, some had been steel, and some had been men. The principle was always the same. Another Marine, younger than Evans, chimed in, "Look at that tape, Sarge. Is that holding it together?" He was referring to the bright garish strip of orange industrial tape wrapped crudely around the rifle's wooden foregrip. It was an ugly, jarring detail on an otherwise classic weapon. The rifle itself was a relic of bolt action, antique whose blued steel had worn to a soft gray patina and whose stock bore the countless dings and scratches of a long and difficult life. It looked less like a precision instrument and more like a forgotten artifact from a dusty attic. Evans stepped closer, planting himself beside Bernard's bench, intentionally crowding the old man. He was trying to project authority to intimidate. "I'm going to need to see your range card and your weapon certification, old-timer. We can't have unsafe equipment on a Marine-affiliated range. That thing looks like it's going to fall apart if you sneeze too hard." Bernard finished his preparations, the click of the bolt sliding home sounding unnaturally loud in the growing silence. Only then did he slowly turn his head, his pale blue eyes clear and perceptive, meeting the sergeant's. He didn't speak. He simply held the younger man's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, only a profound and weary patience, the kind a mountain might show to a passing cloud. The confrontation had started. Minutes earlier, a low murmur of condescension that was now blooming into a full-blown spectacle. Bernard had arrived, as he always did, on the first Tuesday of the month. He drove his 20-year-old pickup truck parked in his usual spot and carried his rifle in a simple canvas case, its contents known only to him and the range officer Dave, who had checked him in with a familiar nod. He set up at the far end of the 1,000-wide line, away from the others, seeking the quiet solitude he preferred for his practice. Then the Marines had arrived, a squad of them, maybe 8 in total, led by Sergeant Evans. They were part of a scout sniper indoctrination program here to use a long-range facilities. They were loud, swaggering, and filled with the invincible energy of young men trained for war. They saw Bernard, a stooped figure with trembling hands and a beat-up rifle, and saw him as an inconvenience of fossil cluttering their training ground. The initial comments were just whispers. Jokes passed between them as they set up their own modern high-tech rifles. Their gear was a world away from Bernard's. Sleek, black chassis, massive scopes with complex turrets, carbon fiber bipods. Their rifles looked like weapons from the future. Bernard's looked like a piece of history. To them, it was a piece of junk. "Hey, Grandpa, you sure you're on the right range?" one of them had called out. "The museum's back in town." Bernard had ignored them, his focus entirely on the ritual of setting up. He laid out a worn leather shooting mat, placed his rifle on its simple bipod, and pulled a single hand-loaded cartridge from a small wooden box. Each movement was deliberate, economical, honed by decades of repetition, but his silence only seemed to egg them on. Sergeant Evans, as a senior Marine, present, felt a need to assert his dominance. He saw the old man in his dilapidated rifle as a representation of everything the modern Marine Corps was. Not old, slow, and obsolete. He decided to make an example of him. "I'm serious, pup," Evans said, his voice rising, drawing the attention of other shooters. Down the line, people began to lower their rifles, turning to watch the unfolding drama. "I'm the acting range safety officer for my unit, and that weapon is a hazard. I want to inspect it." Now, Burnett still didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a worn leather wallet. He slowly, deliberately, extracted a laminated card and placed it on the bench next to him. It was his range certification, perfectly valid. Evans glanced at it, then sneered. "This is expired. Look at the date," Burnett said, his voice raspy but calm. Evans picked up the card. His eyes narrowed. The card had no expiration date. In the space where a date should have been, the word permanent was typed. Below it was a signature, faded but legible, of a base commander from 30 years ago. This only annoyed Evans further. It was another sign of the old man being an exception, a relic living by forgotten rules. "That's not how we do things anymore," Evans snapped, tossing the card back on the bench. "Rules change. We have standards. Now, let me see the rifle." He reached for it. Before his fingers could touch the wood, Burnett's hand, surprisingly fast, covered the receiver. "Don't touch my rifle," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried an undeniable weight, a core of cold steel beneath the frail exterior. For the first time, Evans hesitated. He saw something in the old man's eyes that gave him pause, a flicker of a fire he hadn't expected. But with his men watching, he couldn't back down. He had to reassert his authority. "Are you refusing to cooperate with a range safety officer, sir?" His tone was overly formal, a threat cloaked in procedure. "Because I can have you removed from this facility. I can have that weapon confiscated." The crowd of onlookers was growing. Shooters who had been focused on their own targets were now standing, watching the confrontation. They saw a young, aggressive Marine bullying a senior citizen. The sympathy in the air was thick, but no one wanted to intervene. With a group of active duty Marines, the focus of the mockery kept returning to the rifle, specifically the ugly orange tape. One of the younger Marines, trying to curry favor with his sergeant, pointed again. "Seriously, sir, what's with the tape? Did you run out of glue and bubble gum?" As the Marine's words hit him, the world around Burnett seemed to momentarily warp. The bright, clear sunlight of the range dimmed. The smell of gunpowder and hot dust replaced by the scent of frozen earth and pine. The mocking laughter of the young Marines faded into the high, thin whistle of an Arctic wind. He wasn't in North Carolina anymore. He was on a frozen hill in Korea, the snow stained gray and red. It was December 1950, the chosen reservoir. He saw his own hands, not the wrinkled, liver-spotted hands of an old man, but the frost-bitten, blood-caked hands of a 24-year-old corporal. In them he held his rifle. The stock was shattered, split in two by a sniper's bullet that had missed his head by a fraction of an inch. The weapon was useless. His platoon was cut off, surrounded, and he was their best marksman. He saw the face of the kid next to him. A pilot shot down hours earlier, shivering uncontrollably in the sub-zero temperature. The pilot pushed a small canvas pouch toward him. "Take it." The boy had chatted, his lips blue. "Survival kit. Maybe something in there you can use." Burnett had torn it open. Inside, among fishing hooks and a small compass was a roll of bright orange tape, emergency signal tape. It was flimsy, meant for visibility, not for repairs, but it was all he had. With numb fingers, he had pieced the splintered stock back together, wrapping the orange tape around and around the fracture, pulling it as tight as his failing strength would allow. It was a desperate, ugly fix. But when he was done, the rifle was whole again. Barely. The memory was gone as quickly as it came, a flash of a past that was more real to him than the present. He blinked, the bright sun returning. He could feel the texture of the orange tape under his thumb, a physical link to that frozen hell. It was a scar he had, never allowed to be properly fixed. It was a reminder. Across the range, in the small glass-fronted office, Dave, the civilian range master, watched the scene. Through his binoculars, he was a retired master sergeant himself, and he knew the look of an arrogant NCO throwing his weight around. He also knew Bernard Hicks, the old man had been shooting at this range longer than Dave had been alive. He was quiet, respectful, and better shot with that old rifle than any of the cocky young snipers who came through. Dave had a rule: never interfere with military training. But this wasn't training. This was harassment. He saw Sergeant Evans lean in, his voice a low growl, his posture threatening. He saw the young Marines circling like hyenas, feeding on their leader's aggression. He saw Bernard standing his ground with a quiet dignity that only seemed to enrage the sergeant more. This is your last chance, old man, Evans said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Hand over the rifle or I'll have the MPs down here so fast your head will spin. You'll be spending the afternoon in a holding cell, explaining why you're obstructing military personnel. That was the line. For Dave, that was the final straw. Bullying an old man was one thing. Threatening a man like Bernard Hicks with MPs was something else entirely. It was a profound violation of an unwritten code. Dave turned from the window and picked up the red phone on his desk. The direct line to the base command center. He knew this was a risk. If he was wrong, he could lose his job for crying wolf and interrupting a training schedule. But a deep-seated instinct told him he was not wrong. He punched in a 4-digit extension. The phone was answered on the first ring. Operation. Sergeant Major Reyes speaking. The voice was gruff, impatient. Sergeant Major, this is Dave Mills out at the civilian long-range facility, Dave said, keeping his voice low and steady. What is it? Mills? Way busy. Sorry to bother you. Sergeant Major, we have a situation out here. It involves some of your scout snipers. A Sergeant Evans. There was a sigh on the other end of the line. What's Evans done now? Here's an confrontation with one of my civilian members. It's getting pretty heated. He's threatening to confiscate the man's weapon and have him arrested. Okay, the Sergeant Major said, his voice still laced with annoyance. What's the civilian's name? I'll have someone from the Provost Marshal's office sort it out. Dave took a deep breath. His name is Bernard Hicks. Silence. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound on the line was static. Dave waited. When Sergeant Major Reyes spoke again, his voice was completely different. The impatience was gone, replaced by a tone of shocked disbelief and acute urgency. Say that name again. Mills. Bernard Hicks. Sergeant Major. Is his rifle? Does it have orange tape on the stock? Dave's eyes widened. Yes, sir, it does. Keep everyone there, Reyes commanded, his voice now like a thunderclap. Do not, I repeat, do not let Sergeant Evans touch that man or that rifle. I am on my way. The base commander is on his way. God help that young sergeant. The line went dead. Dave hung up the phone. His heart pounding. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew one thing for certain. Sergeant Evans had just picked a fight with a ghost. Inside the base, Command Operations Center at Camp Leon, Sergeant Major Adrian Reyes stood, frozen, the phone still pressed to his. He slowly placed it back in its cradle as if it were made of glass. The noisy, bustling room around him seemed to fade into a dull roar. Who was that? On the phone, Sergeant Major, a young captain asked from a nearby console. Not looking up from his screen, Reyes didn't answer immediately. He walked over to a large polished wooden plaque on the wall, a plaque listing the names of the base's most distinguished figures. His finger traced down the list, past names of generals and Medal of Honor recipients until it stopped at one name, inscribed on a small brass plate. Gunnery Sergeant Bernard the Ghost. Hicks. Captain, Reyes said, his voice low and grave. Get the colonel now. Sir, Colonel Tyson is in a brief with the division commander. I don't care if his. In a brief with the commandant himself. Reyes snapped, turning to face the young officer. The intensity in the sergeant major's eyes made the captain flinch. You tell him we have a code indigo. Tell him it's Bernard Hicks. A code indigo? The captain stammered. He'd never heard the term. It wasn't in any official manual. It's a code we just invented, Reyes said, already moving toward the door, barking orders at anyone who made eye contact. Get me a 3 vehicle, escort service alphas, and get me the base historian on the line. I want Gunny Hicks's full citation ready to be read. He pointed at a lance corporal. Get a handle on a Sergeant Evans scout. Sniper platoon. Find out everything you can about him and have it on my desk 5 minutes ago. The captain, now, understanding the sheer gravity of the situation, was already on the phone to the colonel's aide. The room, once a hub of routine activity, was now a maelstrom of controlled chaos, all revolving around a name that to most was just a footnote in a history book. Sergeant Major, what's going on? The captain asked, running to keep up with him. Who is Gunny Hicks? Reyes stopped at the door and looked back at the captain, a look of profound, almost pained reverence on his face. Son, gunnery. Sergeant Hicks is the reason we have a scout sniper program. Is the man who took 10 rounds and a piece of shrapnel it had chosen and then proceeded to hold a Regeline by himself for 12 hours, saving the remnants of 2 companies from being overrun. He did it with a rifle that had a broken stock held, together with tape from a pilot survival kit. He is not just a legend. He is Marine Corps history, walking around on 2 feet. And one of our sergeants is out there right now trying to take his rifle away from him. Back at the range, Sergeant Evans's patience had finally evaporated. The old man's quiet defiance, the staring eyes of the onlookers, and the snickering of his own men, which now seemed to hold a note of uncertainty, had pushed him over the edge. He was going to end this. Oh, right, that's it, he declared, puffing out his chest. You are officially detained for creating a public disturbance and failing to obey a direct order from a uniformed service member on federal property. I am confiscating this weapon as evidence. He made a second, more determined grab for the rifle. This time, Bernard didn't stop him with his hand. He simply took one small step back, pulling the rifle out of reach, and cradled it in his arms. It was not an aggressive move, but it was a final one. The line had been drawn. You're making a huge mistake, old man. Evans snarled, his face turning red. He was furious, embarrassed. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder vest. I'm calling the MPs. They'll have you in Cuffs in 5 minutes. He raised the radio to his mouth. Dispatch, this is Sergeant Evans. He never finished the sentence. A sound made him stop. A sound that didn't belong on a remote shooting range. It was the crunch of multiple tires on the gravel driveway, moving fast. 3 immaculate black SUVs, the kind used by high-ranking officials, came into view, kicking up a plume of dust. They didn't park in the designated area. They drove right up onto the edge of the firing line, flanking the confrontation, and stopped in a perfect synchronized halt. The range fell completely silent. The only sound was a clicking of car doors opening. From the first vehicle stepped a man whose presence immediately sucked all the air out of the atmosphere. He was a full colonel. His uniform so perfectly pressed it looked like it was made of steel. On his collar were the silver eagles of his rank, and on his chest was a formidable collection of ribbons, a silent testament to a career spent in harm's way. He was followed by Sergeant Major Reyes, whose own stern face looked like it had been carved from granite. From the other vehicles emerged 4 more Marines, all senior NCOSs, their faces grim and purposeful. Sergeant Evans froze, the radio still held halfway to his face. His jaw went slack. This was a command delegation of a magnitude he had never seen outside of a formal parade. He instinctively snapped to attention, his mind racing, trying to figure out what he had done to warrant a visit from the base commander himself. The colonel's eyes, cold as chips of flint, swept across the scene. They took in the gawking crowd, the nervous-looking young Marines and Sergeant Evans, who now looked like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Then his eyes found Bernard Hicks, and the entire universe shifted on its axis. The colonel's hard expression melted away, replaced by one of profound and absolute respect. He strode forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, his pace quick and certain. He walked right past the ramrod straight Sergeant Evans as if he were a ghost, his entire focus on the old man holding the battered rifle. He stopped 3 feet in front of Bernard. He took a breath, his back straightened, and he executed the sharpest, most flawless salute of his career. His hand sliced through the air, his arm locked at a perfect angle, his gaze locked on Bernard's eyes. Gunnery Sergeant Hicks. The colonel's voice boomed across the silent range. Colonel Tyson, base commander, it is a profound honor to see you again, sir. Behind him, Sergeant Major Reyes and the other senior Marines all snapped to attention and rendered their own salutes. Their movements a single unified gesture of difference. The sound of their heels clicking together on the gravel was like a rifle shot. Bernard, who had stood unmoving through all the mockery and threats, slowly lowered his rifle and brought his own wrinkled hand up in a slightly trembling but perfectly correct return salute. Colonel Bernard's voice was a quiet rasp. Good to see you. Keeping the place in order. Sergeant Evans felt his blood run cold. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Colonel, sir, gunnery sergeant. The words echoed in his head, nonsensical. This frail, stubborn old man was a gunnery sergeant, and the base commander was saluting him. Colonel Tyson dropped his salute and turned, his gaze finally falling upon Sergeant Evans. The warmth was gone, replaced by a glacial fury that made Evans feel physically sick. Sergeant, the colonel said, his voice dangerously quiet. What exactly were you doing? Evans opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, his arrogance and confidence stripped away in an instant, leaving only a raw, terrified panic. Sergeant Major Reyes stepped forward, holding a tablet. Sir, he said to the colonel, though his eyes were boring holes into Evans, I think the sergeant and his men might benefit from a brief history lesson. The colonel nodded. Proceed, Sergeant Major. Reyes cleared his throat, and in a loud, clear voice that carried to every corner of the range he began to read. Gunnery. Sergeant Bernard Hicks, United States. Marine Corps retired. Enlisted in 1948. Served 2 combat tours in the Korean War with the 1st Marine Division. At the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. Then, Corporal Hicks was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. His citation reads in part, with his unit's position being overrun, his platoon leader killed and his own weapon rendered partially inoperable, Corporal Hicks refused to fall back for 12 consecutive hours under heavy and continuous enemy fire in sub-zero conditions. He single-handedly held the western flank of the ridge, repelling multiple enemy assaults and accounting for over 50 enemy casualties, allowing the remainder of his company to withdraw and reorganize. His actions were directly responsible for saving the lives of at least 38 Marines. A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Phones were now openly recording the young Marines behind. Evans looked at each other, their faces pale with dawning horror. The sergeant major wasn't finished. Gunny Hicks went on to serve 3 combat tours in Vietnam, earning 2 Silver Stars and 3 Purple Hearts. In addition to the one he received in Korea, he served as the chief instructor at the Paris Island Marksmanship Training Unit for 20 years, where he personally developed the core doctrines of long-range precision shooting that are still the foundation of our Scout Sniper program today. He personally trained 3 Medal of Honor recipients, 7 Navy Cross recipients, and thousands of United States Marines. He retired in 1985 after 37 years of service. He is without exaggeration a living legend of our Corps. Reyes lowered the tablet, and a heavy silence descended upon the range, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Every eye was on Bernard, who stood looking not at the colonel or the humbled sergeant, but at his old rifle, his hand resting gently on the orange tape. Colonel Tyson took a slow step toward Sergeant Evans, who was visibly trembling. The colonel's voice was no longer loud, but a low, venomous hiss that was somehow more terrifying. You stand here on this range wearing that uniform and you presume to lecture this man. You dare to call his weapon unsafe. Sergeant, the tape on that rifle stock has more combat history than your entire squad combined. That rifle is a registered historical artifact with the Marine Corps Museum. Gunny Hicks is granted the unique privilege of being its permanent custodian. He brings it here once a month to ensure he never forgets how to use it, a lesson you have clearly never learned. He leaned in closer. You spoke of standards. You don't know the meaning of the word. This man is the standard. He is the history you are sworn to uphold, and you treated him with dishonor. You have failed as a Marine. You have failed as a leader. And you have failed as a man. You and your men will report to my office in 1 hour. You will be in your service alpha uniform. I suggest you spend the intervening time contemplating the magnitude of your ignorance. He turned his back on Evans, dismissing him completely, and faced Bernard again, his expression softening. Gunny, I am profoundly sorry for the disrespect you were shown here today. Bernard finally looked up, his pale blue eyes moving from the colonel to the ashamed face of Sergeant Evans. He offered a small, sad smile and placed a calming hand on the colonel's arm. They are children. Colonel, he said, his voice gentle. We train them to be proud, to be lions. Sometimes a young lion's roar is louder than his wisdom. It's not a failure. It's just a part of growing up. He looked directly at Evans, who flinched, as if struck. The Corps doesn't need you to be perfect, son. It just needs you to learn. As Bernard spoke, his thumb brushed against the rough edge of the orange tape on his rifle. The world flickered again, one last echo from the past. He was back in the frozen hell of Chosen, the battle over, the terrible silence of the aftermath ringing in his ears. A young Marine, his arm in a bloody sling, was looking at the ugly makeshift repair on Bernard's rifle. It's ugly gunny, the young man had said, his voice weak. Young Bernard, his face a mask of rust, grime, and exhaustion, had managed a faint smile. It works, he had replied, his voice a raw whisper. When everything else is broken, that's all that matters. The lesson of the tape wasn't just about survival. It was about perseverance. It was about using what you had, no matter how broken, to protect the people beside you. It was a testament to the fact that true strength wasn't in perfection, but in the will to hold things together when they were falling apart. The consequences for Sergeant Evans and his squad were swift, but they weren't what he expected. There was no formal disciplinary action, no entry in his service record book. Colonel Tyson, honoring Gunny Hicks's wisdom, had opted for education over punishment. Evans and his 7 men were ordered to spend the next 2 weeks detached from their unit. Their duty assignment was to report to the base historian every morning at 080. They spent those weeks in the dusty archives of the base library and museum, surrounded by yellowing documents and glass cases filled with relics. They were tasked with a single project to compile a complete historical account of the 1st Marine Division's ordeal at the Chosen Reservoir, with a special focus on the individual acts of heroism that occurred during the breakout. They read after-action reports, personal letters from soldiers who had died there, and transcribed oral histories from the few remaining survivors. For Evans, it was a transformative experience. He read the citation for Bernard's Navy Cross, not from a tablet, but from the original typewritten document. He saw the names of the men Bernard had saved. He read about the impossible odds, the brutal cold, and the sheer unyielding courage it took just to survive, let alone fight. The arrogant pride he had felt in his own uniform was replaced by a profound and humbling sense of reverence for the men who had worn it before him. About a month later, Evans, now in civilian clothes, was sitting alone in a booth at a small diner off base. The door opened, and Bernard Hicks walked in. He moved slowly with the careful steps of the elderly and sat at the counter. Evansy's heart hammered in his chest. He knew he had to do something. He slid out of his booth and walked over to the old man, stopping a respectful distance away. "Gunnery Sergeant Hicks," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Bernard turned. On his stool, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant," he acknowledged with a nod. "Sir, I never properly apologized for my conduct at the range." Evans stammered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "What I did was inexcusable. I was arrogant and disrespectful. There's no excuse for it. I'm sorry." Bernard looked at the young man for a long moment, then gestured to the empty seat beside him at the counter. "Sit down, son. Let me buy you a cup of coffee." Evan, surprised, sat down. They sat in silence for a moment as the waitress poured him a coffee. "You finished your homework with the historian?" Bernard asked, stirring sugar into his own cup. "Yes, sir, we did." "Did you learn anything?" "I learned," Evan said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I didn't know anything about the Corps, about sacrifice, about what real strength looks like." Bernard nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. "Good," he said. "That's a good place to start." They sat there for an hour. 2 Marines from different worlds, Two eras of the same core, talking about rifles and history, and the heavy weight of the uniform they both shared. A bridge had been built, one quiet conversation at a time. Stories like Bernard's remind us that heroes often don't advertise their valor. They live quiet lives among us, carrying the weight of history in their hearts. If this story of quiet courage moved you, please give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among